The mist hung heavy over Lake Atwood, shrouding the water in a ghostly embrace. Just after 1 a.m., two figures emerged from the silent darkness, their steps deliberate as they approached the old wooden pier. They walked into the cold, dark water, voices murmuring in what sounded like fervent prayer, convinced of a divine calling that promised an impossible feat. In the quiet corners of Ohio, some stories defy explanation, weaving faith and fear into a chilling tapestry. This is one such tale, born from the depths of a tranquil lake and the darkness within a family's devotion. Before we dive deeper into this unsettling narrative, let us know in the comments below. Where are you watching us from today? Now, let the silence guide us back to August 22nd, 2025. The summer of 2025 embraced the pastoral expanse of Millersburg, Ohio, painting its landscape in hues of deep green and goldenrod under a vast, often cloudless sky. This tranquil enclave within Holmes County, steadfastly rooted in ancient traditions and unwavering faith, moved to a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the unyielding principles of its Amish inhabitants. Life here was a meticulously woven tapestry of simplicity, arduous labor, and profound devotion, each thread laid with purpose and care. The dwellings, unadorned and robust, stood as quiet testaments to a life deliberately shielded from the din and demands of the modern world. Fields stretched endlessly towards the horizon, diligently tilled and harvested, reflecting the community's deep-seated commitment to self-sufficiency and communal welfare. Along the network of dusty roads, the rhythmic clip-clop of horses drawing buggies served as a familiar counterpoint to the distant, muted hum of essential farm machinery. In this landscape of quiet constancy, families pursued lives of outward serenity, their days meticulously structured by cycles of prayer, physical work, and the unwavering fellowship of their church. Among these families resided the Millers, Ruth R. Miller, a woman of 40 years, and her husband, Marcus J. Miller, age 45. Their home, a modest farmhouse with a meticulously tended garden, bore no distinguishing marks from its neighbors in its external presentation. Within its walls, the subtle hum of family life revolved around their 4 children, creating a familiar domestic atmosphere. The eldest were 18-year-old twins, their names rarely uttered beyond the intimate confines of their home, navigating the threshold of adulthood with the solemnity characteristic of their upbringing. A 15-year-old daughter, her days filled with the quiet industry of domestic chores and the spiritual teachings of her faith, contributed to the orderly cadence of the household. And then there was Vincent, the youngest, a boy of barely 4 years, whose small stature and innate, if restrained, curiosity introduced a vibrant, albeit hushed, presence into the Miller residence. The Millers had long been recognized within Millersburg for their unwavering religious observance. Their attendance at church gatherings was a constant, their adherence to the sacred tenets of their faith visibly woven into the fabric of their daily routines. They worked the family farm collectively, rising with the first light of dawn and retiring as the sun dipped below the horizon, their lives a living testament to shared values and spiritual dedication. To any outside observer, their existence appeared as serene and unshakable as the earth they cultivated. Yet, beneath this carefully maintained veneer of devout tranquility, an insidious, unseen, and unspoken reality had begun to take hold within both Ruth and Marcus Miller. A subtle, yet increasingly discernible, shift in their collective demeanor had slowly manifested, though it remained either unobserved by the wider community, or perhaps simply went unremarked upon. Their conversations, which had once been firmly anchored in the practicalities of farm life and the scriptures, began to occasionally drift into pronouncements that carried an unsettling, unusual intensity. Their devotion, once a quiet and steadfast bedrock of their lives, seemed to sharpen, hardening into something less yielding, marked by prolonged vigils conducted in the hushed, pre-dawn hours and a certain rigidness that began to settle in their gazes. This was not the measured, communal piety of their neighbors. It was something less comprehensible, slowly escalating, subtly changing, month by month. These were the only observable manifestations of internal conflicts, a dangerous confluence of extreme, escalating faith and a growing, profound psychological instability that, like a slow-burning fuse, was drawing them inexorably towards an unimaginable precipice. The simple, devout lives they presented to the world increasingly belied a deepening internal struggle, a perilous entanglement of fervent belief, and an increasingly fractured perception of reality. As August of 2025 progressed into its latter half, a decision was collectively made to commemorate Ruth's 40th birthday. On August 22nd, the family prepared for a weekend excursion to Lake Atwood, a picturesque retreat nestled approximately 132 kilometers south of Cleveland. It was a renowned destination, its expansive waters celebrated for their tranquil surfaces and the lush, verdant shores that gently embraced them. The journey, representing a significant departure from their usual, ordered routines, was undertaken in a recreational vehicle, a temporary vessel designed for leisure and a brief escape. They sought a few days of much-needed respite from the familiar, demanding rhythm of Holmes County life, an interlude of peace before returning to the ordered simplicity that defined their existence. Upon their arrival at the lake, the family carefully settled into their temporary abode. The air surrounding Lake Atwood was characteristically still and cool during the late summer evenings, carrying with it the faint, mingled sense of pine and damp earth. The RV, positioned thoughtfully amidst other vehicles in a designated camping area, provided a self-contained world for the Miller family, a small pocket of privacy within the larger campground. The sounds of distant laughter and chatter emanating from other campers gradually receded as the night deepened, eventually replaced by the persistent chirping of crickets and the soft, rhythmic rustle of leaves stirred by an unseen breeze. The darkness that descended upon the lake was profound, an expansive canvas of impenetrable black, broken only by the faint, flickering glow of scattered campfires and the ethereal, distant shimmer of starlight reflecting dimly on the water's surface. However, for Ruth and Marcus, the profound quietude of that night heralded the emergence of a different kind of sound, an internal resonance that only they could perceive. As the early hours of August 23rd began to unfold, while the rest of the world slumbered in peaceful oblivion and their children lay undisturbed within their bunks inside the trailer, the calm of Lake Atwood was permeated by an unseen, internal shift within the couple. Inside the RV, a quiet intensity descended upon them. Their eyes, though seemingly focused on nothing discernible, appeared to track unseen messages, their breaths growing shallower, more urgent, betraying an escalating agitation. What began as barely audible murmurs escalated into soft, yet unwavering declarations, the words delivered with an absolute conviction that brooked no doubt, no questioning. They were convinced, beyond any rational deliberation, that they were receiving direct communications, clear and undeniable, from a divine source. These were not prayers offered in humble supplication, but rather instructions received, absolute and compelling. These instructions, they understood with terrifying certainty, demanded proofs of faith, visible and undeniable demonstrations of their worthiness before the divine entity they believed was communicating with them. At approximately 1:15 a.m., Ruth and Marcus executed their movements with an unsettling precision, carefully disengaging themselves from the sleeping forms of their children. Their actions were almost ritualistic, devoid of any discernible hesitation or doubt, as they quietly exited the hushed confines of the trailer. The cool, damp air outside enveloped them, carrying with it the pervasive, unmistakable scent of the lake. The sky above remained a canvas of deep, starless black, offering only the most ephemeral illumination from a sliver of distant moonlight that struggled to pierce the heavy, hanging mist. Their path led them deliberately away from the clusters of sleeping RVs, towards the shoreline, and then along the sturdy, weathered wooden planks of the main pier, which stretched with an almost defiant linearity out into the vast, unseen expanse of Lake Atwood. Their steps were measured, each footfall precise and deliberate, carrying the palpable weight of a profound and unshakable conviction. They walked as if guided by an invisible, imperative hand, their gazes fixed with an almost hypnotic intensity on the dark, placid surface of the water ahead. The pier itself was slick with the persistent morning dew, its aged wooden planks cold and unyielding beneath their bare feet. As they reached the very edge of the platform, the point where the man-made structure yielded to the natural liquid expanse, a profound stillness settled between them. It was a shared understanding, a silent communion that transcended spoken words. They were utterly convinced, in that moment, that God was actively summoning them, beckoning them to walk upon the waters. This was, in their dangerously distorted perception, meant to be a sublime gesture of ultimate purity, an absolute and unquestioning act of total surrender to their profound, albeit fractured, faith. The water below, dark and impenetrable, waited with an unnerving patience. They prepared to step into it, each shallow breath a silent, fervent testament to a belief that had, by then, become unshakable, terrifyingly absolute. The profound silence of the lake hung heavy, an eerie, impartial witness to the unfolding dawn of a waking nightmare, a silent prologue to the horror that was about to break. The profound silence that had fallen over Lake Atwood persisted, broken only by the faint lapping of water against the shore and the distant calls of unseen nocturnal birds. Ruth and Marcus Miller stood at the very precipice of the pier, their figures etched against the pre-dawn mist, seemingly unfazed by the encroaching chill of the August night. Their gaze remained fixed upon the dark, unyielding surface of the lake, a vast expanse that mirrored the starless sky above. At precisely 1:15 a.m., with an almost synchronized movement, they stepped forward. Their bare feet, accustomed to the familiar earth of their farm, met the cold, unyielding water. The expectation of buoyant support, of walking upon the liquid surface, was immediately, brutally defied. The water offered no miraculous resistance. Instead, it embraced them, cold and heavy, asserting its undeniable physical presence. In a matter of seconds, the frigid depths rose to their waists, pulling at their clothing, anchoring them firmly to the earth beneath the lakebed. The shock of the cold was a palpable thing, a sharp intake of breath that was not a gasp of fear, but rather a quiet, almost imperceptible tremor of surprise. They did not recoil. Their bodies, though submerged, remained upright, their posture rigid, eyes wide and unwavering as they continued to murmur. The words, though indistinct, carried the unmistakable cadence of fervent prayer, delivered with an intensity that seemed to defy the very physical reality of their immersion. They stood there, waist-deep in the heavy water, for several long moments, their collective silence a strange counterpoint to the soft churn of the water around them as they struggled to maintain their balance on the uneven, unseen bottom. Marcus Miller, his clothing clinging to his form, his face turned towards the dimly perceived horizon, suddenly moved. A subtle shift in his posture, a slight stiffening of his frame, preceded a quiet, yet firm, declaration that carried across the water. It was not a question, but an assertion, suggesting that the initial attempt, the initial immersion, had somehow been insufficient. He communicated that a re-evaluation was necessary, a more rigorous demonstration of commitment required. His perceived divine communication, he seemed to convey, had indicated that this first engagement with the water was not the true test, but merely a preliminary stage, one that he had, in his own mind, failed to execute with the required spiritual precision. The water, he seemed to insist, had not fully recognized their faith. This initial immersion, he believed, had been a spiritual failure, a misstep in the larger divine choreography. With a renewed, almost desperate, resolve, Marcus turned. His movements through the waist-deep water were slow, laborious, the heavy liquid dragging at his soaked clothes. He waded back towards the shore, his feet squelching on the muddy bottom, eventually emerging onto the slick wooden planks of the pier. He did not hesitate. Without pausing, he moved to the edge of the pier, just before the wet would met the drier earth of the bank. There, under the oppressive blanket of the pre-dawn mist, he knelt, his head bowed, his body swaying almost imperceptibly. He began to pray once more. The sound was low, guttural, a continuous, fervent murmuring that suggested an intense dialogue with an unseen presence. His hands, gnarled from years of farm work, clenched and unclenched, pressing against the damp wood, as if drawing strength from the physical act of supplication. The duration of this prayer was unclear, stretching through the silent minutes, a solitary figure communing with the dark. Then, with an abruptness that cut through the silence, Marcus rose. His body, still dripping wet, seemed to possess a renewed energy, a singular purpose. He turned back towards the lake, his gaze sweeping across the dark surface, fixing on an unseen point far out into the murky depths. He announced, his voice carrying a strange, almost manic clarity across the hushed waters, that he would now embark on a truer, more profound test. He would swim, he declared, not merely walk, but swim to a distant sandbar, a shallow rise of earth far from the pier, known only to those familiar with the lake's hidden contours. This, he seemed to communicate with an unwavering conviction, would be the irrefutable proof of his worthiness, the ultimate demonstration of his profound and unbreakable faith before God. His eyes, though still reflecting the dim light, seemed to burn with an inner fire, oblivious to the immense, chilling task he was about to undertake. Ruth Miller remained in the water, waist-deep, her presence an unmoving, silent sentinel. Her gaze was fixed upon her husband as he re-entered the cold, heavy expanse of Lake Atwood for a second time. This time, he did not merely step. He began to move with determined, powerful strokes, pushing himself away from the pier, propelling his body into the deeper, darker sections of the lake. The churning of the water around him was the only sound for a moment, a faint disturbance in the profound quiet. Ruth watched a still, statuesque figure, her face devoid of any discernible expression. Her eyes tracked Marcus's progress, a steady, unblinking focus that betrayed neither alarm nor encouragement. The heavy mist, which had begun to thicken, swallowed the distant shore, creating an isolated bubble around the pier and the swimmer. Marcus continued to swim, his form gradually receding into the gray, watery expanse. Each stroke was an observable act of sheer will, a struggle against the relentless pull of the cold water and the immense, growing distance. For several minutes, his silhouette could be seen, a dark, moving shape against the faint, burgeoning light of the approaching dawn. The sounds of his effort, the rhythmic splash of his arms and legs, slowly faded, becoming muffled, then indistinguishable from the ambient sounds of the lake. The outline of his head, occasionally rising above the surface for a breath, became smaller, less distinct, until it was merely a fleeting flicker in the shifting mist. He swam with a desperate, singular focus, his body straining, pushing against the rising fatigue, driven by an unseen, internal command. But the immense physical demand of the task, combined with the extreme cold of the deep water, began its inevitable toll. The observable power in his strokes visibly diminished. His movements became heavier, less coordinated, each effort a palpable struggle. The distance to the unseen sandbar remained vast, an impossible journey for a man already weakened by the cold and the intensity of his delusion. His head, which had previously risen with a strong, determined push, now barely cleared the surface, his gasps for air growing shallower, more frequent, yet increasingly ineffective. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of desperate exertion, the relentless grip of exhaustion overcame him. His body, stiffened by the cold, weighed down by soaked clothing, visibly faltered. There was no dramatic splash, no cry for help. The last discernible movement was a slow, heavy dip below the water's surface. Marcus Miller simply disappeared. The ripples he had created slowly dissipated, leaving the lake's surface once again placid, dark, and unbroken. Ruth remained in the water, her gaze still fixed on the spot where her husband had last been seen. She did not move, did not utter a sound. The subtle shift in the lake's surface, the brief disturbance of the water, settled back into an unnerving calm. The mist continued to cling, blurring the lines between water and sky, shore and horizon. Marcus's body was not retrieved. The vast, dark waters of Lake Atwood held their secret close, keeping his form hidden beneath its depths. The approaching dawn, which now began to paint the sky with the faintest hints of bruised purple and gray, offered no immediate illumination of the tragedy that had just unfolded. Alone, suspended in the cold water, Ruth Miller remained in a state of profound, unsettling trance. Her eyes, still wide and unblinking, seemed to peer into an unseen realm, processing information that defied all conventional understanding. The drowning of her husband, an act of tragic futility to any rational observer, was interpreted by her deeply fractured mind in a manner that solidified, rather than shattered, her delusion. She perceived his disappearance not as a loss, but as a direct divine message. In her distorted reality, Marcus had not drowned. He had been elevated by God, chosen for a higher purpose. His physical disappearance a sign of his spiritual triumph, his worthiness proven in the ultimate act of surrender. There was no observable grief, no outward sign of sorrow or distress. Her face remained a mask of profound, serene conviction, her body held stiffly in the water. It was in this chilling, trance-like state, as the first faint suggestions of morning light began to touch the mist-shrouded lake, that her delusion solidified into its next, terrifying directive. If Marcus had been elevated, if his disappearance was a testament to divine acceptance, then a path had been illuminated. The test, the ultimate proof of faith, was not complete. The divine call, as she understood it, now extended to another, a smaller, more innocent soul. With an unnerving certainty, a quiet resolution etched onto her features, Ruth Miller made a decision that would forever scar the placid waters of Lake Atwood. The small, 4-year-old Vincent, still sleeping peacefully in the quiet trailer, oblivious to the horror that had consumed his father, must now, in her profoundly twisted understanding, pass through the very same divine ordeal. The stage was set for a new, unspeakable act of perceived devotion. The first faint suggestions of morning light, an anemic, bruised gray, struggled to pierce the persistent mist that clung to Lake Atwood, shrouding the shoreline in an ethereal veil. Ruth Miller remained submerged to her waist in the cold, heavy water, her gaze still fixed on the precise spot where Marcus had last been seen. There was no tremor in her stance, no visible shiver from the biting cold that had claimed her husband. Her face remained a mask of profound, serene conviction, untouched by the tragedy that had just unfolded. After a period that stretched beyond conventional human endurance for such exposure, her body moved with a quiet, deliberate resolve. Slowly, one heavy, waterlogged foot after another, she began to wade back towards the pier. The water, a dark shroud clinging to her clothes, resisted her movements, pulling at her like an unseen hand. Her bare feet squelched softly on the muddy bottom, each step bringing her closer to the familiar planks. She pulled herself onto the dew-slicked wood, her wet clothes leaving dark, transient streaks on the timber. She did not pause to wring out her garments or warm herself. Her walk along the pier, away from the lake's edge, was measured and unhurried, her wet hair plastered to her forehead, her eyes still holding that distant, unseeing intensity. The cold, heavy air seemed to part for her, a silent witness to her unshakable, terrifying purpose. Her bare feet, still caked with a thin layer of mud, found the softer earth of the bank, then the gravel path leading back to the campground, her trajectory unwavering towards the family's recreational vehicle. It was approximately 8 a.m. on August 23rd when the horror began to concretize once more. The RV, nestled quietly among others, still offered the illusion of a peaceful family retreat. Inside, the air was cool, slightly damp with the residual morning mist. Ruth entered the trailer, her wet, cold presence a stark contrast to the sleepy warmth within. She moved directly to the bunk where little Vincent, barely 4 years old, lay curled under a thin blanket. He was still deep in the liminal state between sleep and wakefulness, his small body a picture of innocent vulnerability. Ruth's hand, still cold from the lake, touched his shoulder. Vincent stirred, a soft groan escaping his lips, his eyes fluttering open to reveal a hazy, childlike confusion. He was in his pajamas, a simple, worn fabric that felt slightly damp to the touch from the cool, misty air that had permeated the trailer overnight. He offered no protest, no questions, simply observing his mother's solemn face with the inherent trust of a child. His small hands rubbed his eyes, attempting to clear the remnants of sleep, but he began to follow her, his tiny legs moving slowly, deliberately, as if still held by the dream world. He seemed to perceive nothing amiss in his mother's soaked clothing or the unusual urgency in her silent demeanor. Ruth guided Vincent out of the trailer. The morning mist had begun to thin slightly, revealing a pale, indifferent sun attempting to burn through the gray, but the air remained thick with moisture. She led him towards a small, utilitarian golf cart, a common sight around the campground, often used for short excursions or hauling gear. Its electric motor whirred to life with a soft, mechanical sound, a mundane counterpoint to the profound terror about to unfold. Vincent, still largely obscured by sleep, climbed into the passenger's seat, without a word, his small body barely reaching the top of the seat back. Ruth took the wheel, her hand steady, her gaze fixed forward. The golf cart traversed the gravel paths of the campground, its tires crunching softly, passing other RVs where families were just beginning to stir, preparing for breakfast or their day's activities. None observed the silent, chilling journey of the Miller mother and son. The route led them back to the main pier, the same wooden structure where Marcus had disappeared hours earlier. The mist still hung low over the water, though patches of sunlight now gleamed intermittently on the wet surface of the lake. The wooden planks of the pier, now fully visible, appeared darker, almost black, where the moisture had thoroughly saturated them. They were indeed slick, covered in a persistent, glistening layer of dew, a treacherous surface that added an unspoken layer of apprehension to the scene. The subtle sheen on the wood reflected the gray sky, making the pier appear to float on the water, a path into an indistinct void. Ruth drove the golf cart slowly to the end of the platform, the hum of the electric motor ceasing with a soft click as she brought it to a halt. At the very end of the platform, where the pier jutted out into the lake, Ruth dismounted. Vincent, still sleep-addled and trusting, slid off his seat and toddled uncertainly towards his mother. His small bare feet, unaccustomed to the cold, wet wood, sought purchase on the slippery surface, making him take small, careful steps, his pajamas clinging slightly to his body. Ruth turned, and without a moment of hesitation, she knelt down. She gathered the small boy into her arms, lifting him effortlessly. Vincent, a small bundle of innocence and warmth, was held close against her cold, still damp clothes. He did not struggle, did not question, but looked up at her with large, trusting eyes. His small head rested briefly against her shoulder, his warmth a fragile counterpoint to her cold resolve. Then, as she held him aloft, her gaze fixed on the expanse of water before them, her lips began to move. A sound, low and guttural, like a dry whisper, escaped her throat. It was a murmur, indistinct to any listening ear, but carrying the unmistakable cadence of fervent prayer. The words, though incomprehensible, were delivered with the same unshakable conviction that had marked her actions hours before. She seemed to be offering Vincent, physically and spiritually, to the depths below, convinced beyond all doubt that she was delivering her son to God. A pure offering, an act of ultimate faith. Then, with a terrifying, deliberate motion, Ruth extended her arms. Vincent, still held aloft, blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his small face as he was suddenly suspended over the dark, deep waters. There was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, a moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she released him. The small boy plunged into the frigid depths of Lake Atwood. He vanished almost immediately beneath the opaque surface, swallowed by the dark water as if by an unseen mouth. The surface of the lake, for a few agonizing seconds, churned. Vincent reappeared, his small body struggling violently against the water's relentless pull. His arms, tiny and uncoordinated, flailed wildly, desperate to find purchase, desperate to push himself back towards the life-giving air. A muffled sound, a small, choked gasp, escaped his lips, quickly absorbed by the surrounding silence. His head bobbed briefly, his eyes wide and filled with a sudden, dawning terror that contrasted starkly with his earlier innocence. He fought against the overwhelming cold, against the weight of the water, a desperate, futile struggle for life. But the struggle was brief. The cold, the shock, the sheer power of the deep water quickly overwhelmed his small frame. His flailing slowed, his movements becoming weaker, less defined. The sound ceased. His small body sank, slowly, inexorably, beneath the surface. The water closed over him, leaving only faint, quickly dissipating ripples. The silence of the lake returned, now heavier, more profound, a chilling witness to the horror that had just occurred. The darkness of the deep water took him completely, extinguishing the fragile light of his young life. Even after this unimaginable, horrifying act, the profound, unwavering surge of Ruth's delusion did not cease. There was no observable reaction of remorse, no sign of sorrow, no sudden break in her trance-like state. Her face remained composed, her eyes still holding that distant, unseeing intensity, as if she had merely completed a necessary task, a sacred duty. She did not linger at the pier. With the same quiet, deliberate movements, she turned and walked back along the dew-covered planks, her bare feet making soft, squelching sounds on the wet wood. The golf cart, its electric motor still silent, waited for her. She resumed her place at the wheel, her movements fluid and purposeful. The small vehicle whirred to life once more, reversing its course, carrying her back along the gravel path towards the campground, towards the family's recreational vehicle. Inside the RV, the three older children awaited. The twins, 17 years old, and their 15-year-old sister, had begun to stir, their early morning routine about to begin. They would have noticed their mother's absence, and perhaps the continued absence of their father, a silent anomaly in their usually predictable schedule. They would have observed Ruth's wet clothes, her unusual demeanor, and the stark absence of Vincent. Any unspoken questions or nascent concerns would have been visible on their faces, in their hesitant movements. Ruth entered, her presence filling the small space with an unnerving stillness. Her words, though not recorded, were delivered with the same unwavering conviction that had driven her actions throughout the dark hours. Her delusion, far from abating, had intensified, growing more convoluted and bizarre, yet retaining its absolute hold over her. She communicated, with a terrifying certainty, that they too, the remaining children, must now test their faith. The message she seemed to convey was clear. A new, specific, and profoundly unsettling directive had been received. This test, she instructed, required an act of profound surrender, a willingness to be consumed. They must, she conveyed, allow themselves to be swallowed by a fish. The sheer strangeness of the command, the grotesque imagery it evoked, would have been apparent to any rational mind, but to the children, raised in unquestioning obedience, under the influence of their mother's terrifying conviction, it was presented as an irrefutable divine command. The stage was now set for another shocking, incomprehensible act of perceived devotion, a dark progression in a nightmare disguised as ultimate faith. The silent, waiting RV became a crucible for a new, unspeakable terror. The morning mist, which had clung stubbornly to the surface of Lake Atwood, finally began to yield to the insistent presence of the late August sun. Patches of pale blue sky became visible above the trees, and the air, though still cool, carried the scent of warming earth and pine. Inside the Miller family's recreational vehicle, an unsettling calm had settled after Ruth's return from the pier. Her wet clothes had been discarded, replaced by dry, simple garments, yet her demeanor remained unchanged, marked by that distant, unwavering gaze. The three older children, the 17-year-old twins, and their 15-year-old sister, were now fully awake, their initial sleepy confusion giving way to a nascent apprehension. They had observed their mother's return alone, noted the absence of their father and little Vincent. The sight of their mother, newly dressed but still radiating an eerie, serene intensity, would have registered as an anomaly. They listened as she spoke, her voice low and even, delivering the latest divine directive. Her words, though spoken without inflection, carried an absolute authority that had, for years, been an unquestioned part of their upbringing. This was not a suggestion or a request. It was a command, a continuation of the proofs of faith that had begun hours earlier. The specifics of this new test were profoundly bizarre, yet delivered with the same unshakable conviction as all previous pronouncements. They must, she conveyed, allow themselves to be swallowed by a fish. The sheer, grotesque imagery of the order, the inherent impossibility and horror it suggested, would have been apparent to any mind not steeped in years of unquestioning obedience and the insidious erosion of rational thought that had permeated their home. For the children, however, a lifetime of being taught that their parents' word, especially when concerning matters of faith, was absolute truth, had stripped them of the capacity for immediate dissent or even open questioning. Their faces, though pale, exhibited a deeply ingrained compliance, a quiet submission born of habit and reverence. They moved with a slow, almost mechanical quality, collecting themselves, preparing to follow their mother's latest directive, their eyes reflecting a quiet, internalized fear that was rapidly being subsumed by profound obedience. It was approximately 10:30 a.m. when Ruth Miller and her 3 remaining children emerged from the RV. The campground was now bustling with the sounds of typical morning activity. Distant laughter, the clatter of breakfast dishes, the low murmur of conversations. Other campers, enjoying their Saturday morning by the lake, would have seen the Miller family, outwardly a picture of quiet Amish solemnity, walking towards the waiting golf cart. Ruth led the way, her posture straight, her gaze fixed. The teenagers followed, their movements somewhat stiff, their expressions unreadable, carrying an internal tension that was only barely suppressed. They climbed into the golf cart, the twins, one on each side, and their sister nestled between them, forming a compact, silent unit. The electric motor whirred to life, a familiar sound around the lake, but this time, it was driven with an unusual, almost reckless speed. Ruth pressed the accelerator, and the small vehicle shot forward, kicking up gravel from the path. It moved at a pace far beyond the usual leisurely speed of campground golf carts, accelerating rapidly towards the lake's edge. The wind whipped past the children's faces, a jarring sensation that roused them further from their trance-like obedience. Their bodies swayed with the speed, forcing them to grip the sides of the cart, their knuckles white. The serene landscape, previously a backdrop for quiet leisure, now blurred into a dangerous, accelerating tunnel. The golf cart careened around a bend, its tires squealing faintly on the gravel, bypassing other campers who might have glanced up, noticing the unusual speed, perhaps dismissing it as youthful exuberance or a momentary lapse of judgment. Their destination was clear, a section of the lake's margin where a low, rustic stone wall, designed perhaps as a decorative barrier or a fishing spot, offered a stark, hard edge to the water. The cart approached it at full speed, the ground vibrating under its momentum. The teenagers, though conditioned to obedience, would have registered the accelerating danger. Their eyes widened, their grips tightened. A sudden, sharp realization of impending physical peril would have pierced through the fog of their religiously induced compliance. Fear, primal and undeniable, would have begun to surface. The collision was abrupt and violent. The golf cart slammed into the stone wall with a sickening crunch of metal and shattering plastic. The impact reverberated through the air, a sharp, unexpected sound that momentarily silenced the surrounding campground. The small vehicle, its front end crumpling, did not stop there. Its momentum carried it over the edge of the wall, pitching it forward. With a heavy splash, it plunged into the lake. The water, which only hours earlier had claimed Marcus and Vincent, now swallowed the golf cart whole, carrying it down into its murky depths. For a moment, all that remained was the disturbed surface of the lake, slowly rippling, and the faint, acrid smell of burning wires carried on the breeze. The golf cart, entirely submerged, rested just beneath the surface, its shadowy outline still faintly visible through the now thinning mist, a silent monument to the twisted act. For the 3 teenagers, the sudden, violent immersion was a shock that ripped through the last vestiges of their induced obedience. The freezing cold of the water, the sudden disorientation of being submerged, the desperate need for air, these primal sensations obliterated the careful conditioning of their upbringing. It was an instinct for survival, raw and unyielding, that took over. They struggled against the seatbelts, against the confining structure of the sinking cart. Their movements were frantic, uncoordinated, but driven by an urgent, life-preserving imperative. Each managed to free themselves, their bodies propelled upwards by the natural buoyancy that defied their mother's commands of surrender. They broke the surface of the water, gasping, coughing, sputtering. The air, cold and wet, filled their burning lungs. Then they began to swim. Their strokes were desperate, fueled by adrenaline and a sudden, undeniable terror. They swam towards the nearest visible point of land, the stone wall, pulling themselves onto the damp earth, their bodies shaking violently from the cold and the profound shock. As they clambered onto the bank, drenched and shivering, a sound erupted from them, screams. Raw, guttural, terrified screams that pierced the morning air, carrying across the lake and into the campground. They cried for help, their voices hoarse with fear and effort, the sudden, audible break in their silent compliance, a desperate plea to the world around them. These screams, sharp and unmistakable, were the first clear signal that something was terribly wrong. Campers who had been enjoying their morning coffee or preparing to cast their fishing lines looked up, startled by the intensity of the noise. They saw the three drenched teenagers, shivering violently, pointing back towards the submerged golf cart and the figure of a woman, Ruth Miller, standing calmly by the water's edge. A palpable sense of alarm, a collective unease, rippled through the campground. Several individuals, without hesitation, moved towards the site of the collision. They were the first witnesses, their quick actions leading to the crucial call to authorities. Emergency services were immediately contacted, descriptions of the frantic children and the submerged vehicle hastily conveyed. Within what felt like an impossibly short time, the tranquil peace of Lake Atwood was shattered by the arrival of flashing lights and the blare of sirens. Park rangers, their uniforms stark against the verdant backdrop, arrived first, quickly followed by deputies from the Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Office. The scene that greeted them was surreal, a tableau of unsettling contradictions. The three teenagers, still visibly traumatized, were huddled together, shivering uncontrollably, their faces pale and streaked with tears, their frantic explanations barely coherent. The golf cart remained partially visible beneath the water, a submerged, mangled hulk. And then there was Ruth Miller. She stood by the water's edge, wet, disheveled, and barefoot, her simple clothes clinging to her form. Her gaze remained distant, unseeing, reflecting no discernible emotion, no panic, no sorrow, no remorse. Her eyes seemed to look past the arriving officials, past the traumatized children, into some internal landscape known only to her. When approached by the first responders, she calmly, almost dismissively, refused any offered assistance. Her words, delivered in a low, even tone, were profoundly disturbing. She seemed to imply that her physical state was secondary, irrelevant. She asked the emergency personnel, her voice devoid of urgency, just to pray for her, a request that only deepened the officials' unease, betraying a complete disconnect from the immediate reality of the accident and the children's distress. The initial interrogations, conducted on the spot amidst the growing confusion and the gathering officials, quickly veered into unsettling territory. When one of the park rangers, Captain Adam Fisher, a seasoned investigator, cautiously inquired about her youngest son, Vincent, Ruth's response was delivered with the same serene, unsettling calm. "I gave him to God," she stated, her words dropping into the tense air like stones into still water, utterly devoid of any emotional weight or a sense of the gravity of her declaration. The officials exchanged uneasy glances. The implication was clear, yet unimaginable. Then, questioned about her husband, Marcus, Ruth offered an equally bizarre and disturbing statement. "He's at the bottom of the lake, inside a fish." The sheer strangeness of her words, the absolute conviction with which they were uttered, confirmed the officials' growing suspicion. They were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual, whose perception of reality had fractured into something horrific. As more questions were posed, as the reality of her statements began to sink in with the authorities, Ruth Miller suddenly moved. With an unexpected burst of energy, she attempted to evade the officers, turning sharply and running. Her barefoot sprint was directed away from the clustered officials, towards a thick patch of dense undergrowth and tall bushes bordering the camp perimeter. Her movements were erratic, desperate, a sudden, animalistic attempt to conceal herself. The officials quickly apprehended her, but her sudden flight was later noted by investigators as further evidence of her profoundly altered mental state, a desperate attempt to escape a reality she could no longer comprehend. The bizarre and deeply disturbing declarations, combined with the frantic testimony of the surviving teenagers, immediately elevated the situation. The implicit threat to Vincent, confirmed by Ruth's chilling statement, prompted an urgent, immediate response. Dive teams were mobilized without delay. The tranquil waters of Lake Atwood, once a recreational haven, were now transformed into a grim search area. The process was methodical, painstaking, each pass of the divers a cold, calculated effort against the lake's murky depths. As the afternoon wore on, and the light began to fade, casting long, somber shadows across the water, the search continued with growing urgency. Finally, as twilight began to settle, approximately around 6 p.m., a discovery was made. The body of little Vincent Miller was found at the bottom of the lake, eerily close to the very end of the main pier, the same spot where he had been thrown into the water hours earlier. The profound silence of the lake deepened, now bearing witness to an unspeakable sorrow. The discovery of Vincent Miller's small body in the darkening waters of Lake Atwood cast a profound pall over the entire campground. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles, which had arrived to address a golf cart accident, now illuminated a scene of unspeakable tragedy. Divers continued their methodical search through the night and into the following morning. It was not until 8:30 a.m. on August 24th that Marcus J. Miller's body was finally recovered. It was found a considerable distance from the pier, approximately 53 yards out, deep within the murky embrace of the lake. The two autopsies that followed confirmed the grim reality. Both father and son had died by drowning, their final moments consumed by the cold, indifferent waters of Lake Atwood. The subsequent investigation into the events of August 23rd unfolded with a chilling precision, piecing together the fragments of a nightmare. Captain Adam Fisher, the lead investigator for the case, found himself grappling with a narrative that defied conventional understanding. His encounters with Ruth Miller during the interrogations were particularly unsettling. Throughout the process, her behavior remained confusing and deeply disquieting. She articulated her actions, particularly the act of casting Vincent into the lake, with a placid, unwavering conviction. She repeatedly affirmed that she had thrown the boy into the waters to deliver him to God, her voice devoid of any discernible emotion, any tremor of doubt or regret. The officers present observed a profound absence of remorse, a disturbing tranquility that seemed completely disconnected from the gravity of her statements. Her eyes, though focused, appeared to look through her interlocutors, fixed on an internal vision. Captain Fisher later recounted the profound impact of her detachment. He described how Ruth seemed to possess no notion of the gravity of her acts, a phrase that captured the chilling chasm between her perception and reality. At one peculiar moment during the questioning, a paramedic, attending to her physical well-being, found himself confronted by Ruth's unexpected request. She asked him, in a calm and almost polite tone, to kneel and pray with her. This request, delivered without any apparent awareness of the unfolding criminal investigation or the horrific implications of her words, only solidified the impression of her severe mental dissociation, an unwavering adherence to her own twisted spiritual narrative. Meanwhile, the three surviving Miller children, though physically unharmed, remained profoundly traumatized. Sheriff Orvis Campbell, overseeing the broader investigation in Tuscarawas County, addressed the perplexing aspect of their unquestioning obedience. He explained their behavior with a directness that underscored the insidious nature of their upbringing. They grew up believing everything their mother and father said was the truth, Campbell stated, his words drawing a stark picture of their formative years. They didn't question anything. So, when they were told to jump into the lake, they jumped. This observation illuminated the potent combination of extreme religious doctrine and a deeply ingrained familial authority that had stripped the children of their critical faculties and their natural instincts for self-preservation, at least until the immediate physical trauma of the lake water broke through. As the investigation continued, a clearer, albeit tragic, picture began to emerge. Records revealed that both Ruth and Marcus Miller had a documented history of mental health disorders, a detail that had remained largely hidden within the private sphere of their insular community. These documented histories provided a crucial context for the horrific events, suggesting a long-standing, untreated vulnerability that had finally erupted into catastrophic delusion. Investigators meticulously cross-referenced witness testimonies and forensic evidence. Based on their findings, they determined that Marcus Miller was not involved in the drowning of his son Vincent, nor in the subsequent actions involving the three older children. The evidence strongly suggested that Marcus had likely succumbed to accidental drowning while attempting his own proof of faith, a victim of his own profound delusion and the unforgiving elements. His death was a tragic consequence of his mental state, separate from the direct, deliberate actions Ruth would later undertake. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the local Amish community, traditionally reserved and private, found itself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. They responded with a public statement, a rare departure from their usual reticence, lamenting the deaths and seeking to clarify the community's stance. The statement emphasized that the actions of the couple do not reflect the teachings of the Amish faith, but are a consequence of untreated mental illness. It was a critical distinction, seeking to separate the horrifying acts from the spiritual tenets of their deeply held beliefs. The statement further indicated that the ministry and family members had already been attempting to assist Ruth and Marcus with spiritual and professional support, suggesting a prior awareness of their struggles, albeit an awareness that tragically proved insufficient to avert the impending catastrophe. By August 27th, Ruth Miller was formally charged. The accusations against her were severe, reflecting the heinous nature of her actions. She faced 2 counts of aggravated murder, both pertaining to the death of her son, Vincent. One charge stipulated premeditation and planning, suggesting a chilling level of intent within her deluded state, while the second count specifically cited the killing of a child under the age of 13. In addition to these gravest charges, she also faced accusations of domestic violence and child endangerment, directly related to her actions involving the 3 older children and the incident with the golf cart. These were the formal beginnings of a legal process that would seek to reconcile the incomprehensible with the demands of justice. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. On September 5th, a grand jury in Tuscarawas County formally indicted Ruth Miller on a total of 7 charges, expanding upon the initial accusations. From the day of the incident, August 23rd, until September 1st, 2025, Ruth remained hospitalized for a comprehensive mental health evaluation. This period of assessment was crucial to determining her mental state at the time of the crimes and her fitness to stand trial. Following this initial evaluation, she was finally transferred to the Tuscarawas County Jail. An arraignment hearing was promptly scheduled for September 8th, before Judge Michael J. Ernest, marking the official commencement of her trial. If ultimately found guilty of the aggravated murder charges, Ruth Miller faced a minimum sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years, or, at the maximum, life imprisonment without any possibility of parole, ensuring she would remain incarcerated for the remainder of her life. The entire case sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet corners of Millersburg, resonating across the state of Ohio and reigniting a profound, often uncomfortable debate. It forced a critical re-examination of the intricate, often blurred, boundaries between profound religious faith and severe mental illness. Experts in psychology and sociology issued warnings, highlighting how mystical delusions could be dangerously exacerbated by factors such as social isolation, chronic sleep deprivation, and the unchecked proliferation of extreme beliefs. The Miller case became a stark, chilling example of devotion tragically twisted into destruction. Today, Lake Atwood, once cherished as a peaceful refuge, carries a heavy, indelible weight. Its tranquil waters, once a source of leisure and solace, are now permeated by a pervasive sense of gloom. Local fishermen, those who know the lake best, openly admit to avoiding the area near the main pier where the bodies of Marcus and Vincent were recovered. The unspoken agreement to steer clear of that particular stretch of water is a testament to the lingering unease. Some residents, their voices hushed, report hearing the distant, mournful cry of a child on cold, silent nights when the mist rolls in thick from the water. Others claim to have glimpsed the fleeting silhouette of a small boy, seemingly playing alone at the lake's edge, only for the apparition to vanish abruptly when approached, dissolving into the swirling fog. These are the threads of new urban legends, whispered tales, that now define the lake's modern identity. The Amish community, already reserved by nature, became even more insular in the wake of the tragedy. Few speak openly about what occurred, and the precise location where the events unfolded. The pier, the stretch of water, has been left largely untouched, a somber, unofficial monument. It is as if the memory of the Miller family's test of faith still hovers palpably over the waters, an unseen presence that permeates the very air. It stands as a dark, enduring reminder that when the unwavering certainty of faith becomes dangerously entangled with the insidious grip of delusion, the sacred can be tragically warped, and devotion can be mercilessly transformed into an unimaginable, chilling horror. The silence of the lake, once peaceful, now echoes with a perpetual, haunting sorrow. The waters of Lake Atwood, once a tranquil mirror to the Ohio sky, now hold a profound and enduring sorrow. They bear witness to a devotion twisted into destruction, a sacred vow distorted into an unspeakable horror. The chilling narrative of the Miller family stands as a stark testament to the fragile line between unwavering faith and the insidious grip of delusion. A family, once bound by tradition and belief, unraveled into a tragedy that etched itself into the very fabric of the landscape, leaving behind not just loss, but a haunting echo in the quiet corners of a community. The trials and accusations, the legal structures attempting to grasp the incomprehensible, merely serve to codify the visible aftermath of a descent into madness, a descent born from an untreated darkness that masqueraded as divine will. This story, woven from the threads of devotion and psychological turmoil, compels us to reflect on the unseen battles fought within the human mind. It reveals how easily the pillars of belief can become distorted, how isolation can amplify the whispers of delusion until they become thunderous commands. It forces us to confront the terrifying consequences when the most profound commitments are tragically misdirected, leaving behind a legacy of pain and an indelible mark on the places where such events unfold. The lingering whispers around Lake Atwood, the averted gazes of the fishermen, the amplified silence of the Amish community, all speak to a truth more profound than mere facts. Some wounds linger, not just in memory, but in the very air and water. What, in your reflection, do you believe could have averted the tragic spiral of the Miller family? Share your thoughts and insights in the comments below. And if these narratives of forgotten horrors and chilling truths resonate with you, consider joining our silent host. A like on this video and a subscription to Host of Silence ensures you won't miss our next journey into the depths of human darkness and the unexplained.